antidote to our problems in this country when it comes to judges and politics is not to deny you a place on the Supreme Court. This is exactly where you need to be. This is exactly the time you need to be there. And I am telling President Trump, you do some things that drive me crazy. You do some great things. You have never done anything better, in my view, than to pick Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, because you had an opportunity to put well-qualified conservatives on the court, men steeped in the rule of law who will apply analysis, not politics, to their decision-making, and you knocked it out of the park. And to my friends on the other side, you can't lose the election and pick judges. If you want to pick judges, you better win.
Oh, Obama used to tell us that. Lindsey Graham hammering Senate Democrats for their outrageous behavior at today's hearing. Also breaking tonight, the New York Times reporting Robert Mueller will accept some written answers from the president. Does this mean the investigation is going to come to an end ever? Finally, nearly 500 days. Here to weigh in on all of this is the president's attorney, also the chief counsel for the American Center for Law and Justice, Jay Sekulow, who has done legal work for me in the past, and we actually broke bread together. And met and talked once about sports. Good to see you. How are you? Let's start with
you, Sean. Good.
You've argued before the Supreme Court personally, what, 12 times?
Yep.
Yeah, ACLJ 20 times?
Yep.
And you won most of your cases, right?
We've been very fortunate, very blessed in that regard. You don't win them all, but we've won an overwhelming majority. And if you include the others you mentioned, we've had a number of cases that have been summarily reversed. We've had a good track record. But look, I've also won these cases. Some of them we've won unanimously, a number of them unanimously. It depends on the nature of the case. But I got to tell you something. The president has made two fantastic picks. Neil Gorsuch, tremendous judge, now justice. Brett Kavanaugh, who I've known for a long time, is brilliant, has been a great judge. And if you want to know anything about Brett Kavanaugh, read his 312 opinions. That may be a good way to start. So you saw theatrics today in the Senate, but at the end of the day, guess what happens? Judge Kavanaugh becomes Justice Kavanaugh and is confirmed to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the president gave a great selection with both of these justices. I mean, and reshaping the court literally for decades with a conservative judicial philosophy. Lindsey Graham said it, elections in that context have consequences. And here the selection of Brett Kavanaugh is, I think, is probably the most qualified
really sad
judge out there for this position.
That the orchestration that went on today, those two young girls that went into the courtroom, that they had to watch their dad go through that process. Nearly said it. I was really careful. All right, let me move on.
But Brett Kavanaugh's opening statement, though, Sean, I thought Brett Kavanaugh's opening statement and what the president tweeted out about what was going on in the Senate kind of summed it all up. Are these senators really going to tangle with Brett Kavanaugh? Because let me tell you who wins that one. Brett Kavanaugh.
Is that? I think it's a fait accompli. It's interesting to watch. Yeah. New York Times headline: Mueller will accept some written answers for Trump. It's been a number of weeks since you and your legal team responded to the special counsel. Some were wondering if there's going to be a fight, whether they would subpoena the president. May still happen. Tell us what you can about what this means. And I know there's only so much you can say.
Yeah, and I've got to be obviously very careful. So let me tell you this. We have an ongoing dialogue with the Office of Special Counsel. Myself and our colleagues have continued an ongoing dialogue. That dialogue continues. I'm not going to discuss the contents of what has been agreed to or not agreed to, but I will tell you this. I'm not concerned about the President of the United States responding if we decide to accept the proposition of responding to written questions, responding to questions about Russia and interference with the election. The president is committed. There's no crime here. There's no underlying crime that the president was involved in. I'm not concerned about where that goes. Look, I mean, if they ask questions and we think they're appropriate, we would respond. Again, we haven't even responded to the special counsel's
but the White House counsel
response to our letter. But it's
the White House counsel spent 30 hours testifying before, which to me is mind-blowing. But it seems to me that if, in fact, Don McGahn gave him 30 hours, and if the president were to go in and say one thing contradictory to what McGahn said, that then sets him up for a perjury trap. And every lawyer...
Well, you're jumping way ahead of the discussion to go to what happens if there was an interview or not an interview. But what you said is very important. This White House has been the most transparent in history when it comes to investigations or inquiries like this. You mentioned Don McGahn's 30 hours of testimony. There's been 30 other witnesses that the White House put forward to testify. There's been over 1.4 million pages of documents that have gone forward. So the idea that the special counsel has not been given access to information, I think they would be readily admit that this has been a transparent investigation and a transparent inquiry. There's all this media spin going on about what was said or what wasn't said, but let me tell you this. The President of the United States authorized his legal team, both his White House counsel and his private lawyers, to engage this in a transparent basis, and that's been done. This does need to come to an end. I mean, I think everybody in the country wants this to come to an end. I don't give dates and times. It needs to happen sooner rather than later. But look, at the end of the day, as I said, it's a process of negotiation. It's ongoing. I'm not going to disclose the nature of that. But there's been a lot of speculation in the media today. I will tell you this much. Look at what has happened so far and what the number of documents and the number of witnesses that have gone forward.
Do we have to worry about what John Dowd has said publicly on this network, or say what we reported about Andrew Weissman and back channel information from Christopher Steele and text messages and communications that show that, in fact, Christopher Steele was trying to funnel information to the special counsel?
Well, look, my former colleague John Dowd denied unequivocally today the reports that came in regarding the excerpts of the book that were released regarding a purported meeting that he had and I had regarding they called it basically a reenactment of a conversation that never took place. And John said that that was not correct, that did not happen. It did not happen. With regard to the other issues you brought up, the irregularities in this inquiry from the outset, including the beginning of it, which is the dossier issue, which starts the whole thing, of course that's an issue. I can give you a whole list. We don't have the time to go through that again. Yeah. But look, all of that's relevant to the nature and the scope of this inquiry and its just resolution. At the end of the day, as I said, I am convinced that we're going to get it there. We're going to end this soon, but I don't give dates. But I will tell you this, I'm not worried about questions on Russia.
Okay, Jay Sekulow, it'll be interesting to see if this becomes, if you will, James Comey 2, weeks before an election. Thanks for being with us.
Well, Judge Kavanaugh was the one in the hot seat today, but it was the president often taking center stage during the hearings for his second Supreme Court nominee. Personal attorney for the president and Supreme Court advocate himself, Jay Sekulow, is here to weigh in on what we saw today. Good evening, Jay.
Hi, Shannon. How are you?
I'm good. I want to play a little something, first of all, with the ranking member, Senator Dianne Feinstein, the top Democrat. Here's her interchange with the nominee.
Can a sitting president be required to respond to a subpoena?
Going with the Justice Ginsburg principle, which is really not the Justice Ginsburg alone principle. It's everyone's principle on the current Supreme Court. And as a matter of the canons of judicial independence, I can't give you an answer on that hypothetical question.
And, Jay, he was asked a lot of other questions, including by Senator Blumenthal, who said, I want you to promise to recuse on any case that would come before you involving the president. Is it posturing, or are these legitimate legal questions and concerns by the Democrats?
Well, they're not legitimate at all. Let me say, I've argued in front of the Supreme Court for over 3 decades. And the idea that a nominee of a sitting president would have to recuse himself involving cases that might involve the president or policies of the president would mean justices would be recusing themselves on every case. So that's absurd. What is Brett Kavanaugh going to do? If a case comes before him, he's going to review the briefs, listen to the oral arguments, and make a decision to defend the Constitution of the United States as he views the Constitution. That is what we expect of Article III judges. That is what we expect of Supreme Court justices. And, I noticed on some of the other networks, they were talking about this, Brett Kavanaugh having a grilling, is what one of the networks said today before the Judiciary Committee. Now, I know, Shannon, you've been covering this for a long time, and you've been covering it today and very thoroughly. But there was no grilling of Brett Kavanaugh. In fact, Dianne Feinstein had to come in at one point to correct Senator Leahy, who was pointing out, trying to cross-examine, so to speak, Brett Kavanaugh with a document saying there was a reference to him in this particular document. And when everybody looked at it, and Senator Leahy finally was told that it doesn't reference the nominee to the Supreme Court, and it was Senator Feinstein that says he's not in it. It's not there. Oh, okay, let's go to the next document. So the lack of preparation, this is a lot of show. The fact is, under the Constitution, Brett Kavanaugh has a job to do when he's confirmed, and he will be confirmed as a justice of the Supreme Court, and I suspect before the first Monday in October, that he will be a justice on that court. And the fact is, he reviews the law, reviews the facts, listens to the arguments, and makes a decision like every other justice in the Supreme Court.
And I talked to Senator Lee, a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, who questioned Kavanaugh today as well, probed him on a number of issues. I also talked to him about this story today about this senior Trump official who has this anonymous piece in the New York Times, and whether it's fair for someone close to the president or in his orbit to make these kinds of claims. Here's what Senator Lee told me.
I think it's kind of odd for somebody to stay in under the false pretense that they're there to help, that they're there to be a part of the administration if they're actively undermining it. Now, if they see things that are wrong, that are illegal, that are immoral, they ought to leave.
Are you worried that there are people around the president who don't have his best interest at heart?
Look, I'm not going to comment on Anonymous. I mean, let's start with that first, okay? Anonymous is doing an op-ed. You know, it's one thing you got anonymous sources, an article. This is an anonymous op-ed. So, you know, to me, looking at this as the president's lawyer, this is, I mean, look what's going on right now. We've got a nomination to the Supreme Court of the United States. You've got international issues that are very significant involving China and Russia, North Korea, and we're talking about Anonymous. Now, let's just focus on that for a moment. We're talking about an anonymous op-ed in the New York Times. So, I mean, let's think about this for a moment, Shannon. You and I have been talking about a Supreme Court nominee that will serve for life, that will have an impact on the Constitution of the United States for decades, which is what they're supposed to do. And instead, we're now talking about Anonymous. So let me tell you what my answer to Anonymous is. I'm not talking about Anonymous.
Okay. With that in mind, listen, when I was a practicing attorney, I much preferred interrogatories, written questions for my client. I know these are things you're negotiating. You can't talk about the substance of what you're talking about with the special counsel, but can you give us a timeline that you think this might be resolved one way or another?
Well, let me tell you what I don't give. And you know that from me, you've known me a long time. I don't give timelines. Look, I think it needs to be wrapped up soon for the good of the country, for our national security interests. Just to get this investigation done. This has been the most transparent inquiry of a White House in history. 1.4 million documents, over 30 witnesses that were put forward by the administration. This was as transparent. I mean, I don't think Bob Mueller would argue that this is not transparent. So it's very transparent. Now, when you get down to the question of where we are now, I'm not going to, as you said, I'm not going to, our policy is we're not going to comment on ongoing dialogue that we have with the Office of Special Counsel. I'm not going to breach that here. I wouldn't do that. I will tell you this, though. Obviously, there's a process that you go through. We've looked at this historically. There's a lot of administrations have had these kind of inquiries before, and you handle it in an appropriate way. Our job, my job, Mayor Giuliani's job, the Raskins, our legal team's job, is to defend the president. That's our job, of what any lawyer would do in a situation like this, and we're going to do recommend what's in the best interest of the president, what we think is the appropriate review here, and I'm hopeful that it will be resolved sooner rather than later. That's about as good as I'm going to say. That's about the date I'll give you, sooner rather than later.
Okay, we'll take it. Jay, keep us updated.